Winter in Minneapolis can be a force of nature, unrelenting, bone-chilling, and at times, isolating. It's the kind of cold that makes you pull your coat tighter, quicken your steps, and pray for the warmth of home. But in the heart of this frozen city, during one of its harshest winters, a single act of kindness sparked a flame that would warm not just one soul, but thousands. Picture this: a lonely bus stop, a blanket, and a note that read, "Stay warm." What if I told you that this simple gesture could change an entire city? Today, on Tales from the Heart, I'm sharing a true story from Minneapolis, Minnesota, a story of compassion, community, and the incredible power of a small act of love. This is the tale of the bus stop blanket that warmed a city. Stay with me, because this journey might just remind you of the warmth we can all share, even in the coldest of times. It was late December 2022, and Minneapolis was locked in a brutal winter. The city, known for its icy lakes and frosty air, was experiencing a cold snap that pushed temperatures down to -15 degrees Fahrenheit, lower with the wind chill. For those who could stay indoors, it was a time for cozy fires and hot cocoa. But for many others, the daily struggle to get to work, to school, or to find a warm place to rest was a battle against the elements. On Lyndale Avenue, a busy street lined with small shops and tall, snow-dusted buildings, a modest bus stop stood exposed to the wind. It was little more than a bench and a sign, no shelter, no walls, just a cold slab of metal where people waited for the number 4 bus. Every day, this bus stop became a gathering place for a cross-section of Minneapolis life. There was the young man in a thin jacket, his hands stuffed deep in his pockets, his breath visible in the air. There was an elderly woman, her scarf pulled up over her nose, clutching a grocery bag with trembling fingers. And there was a teenager, her backpack slung over one shoulder, bouncing on her toes to keep warm. Some were workers heading to late shifts at diners or hospitals. Others were homeless, seeking a brief moment of rest on the bench before moving on. In a city of over 400,000 people, this bus stop was a tiny microcosm of struggle, resilience, and quiet hope. Into this scene walked Lisa Thompson, a 54-year-old schoolteacher who had lived in Minneapolis her entire life. Lisa was no stranger to winter, she'd grown up skating on frozen ponds and building snowmen with her siblings. But as she trudged through the snow that evening, her bag slung over her shoulder, something felt different. She'd just finished a long day at school, where she taught third graders how to read and write. Her classroom was warm, filled with laughter and the smell of crayons, but out here, the cold was a stark reminder of the challenges so many faced. As she approached the bus stop, she noticed the faces of the people waiting, faces etched with exhaustion, cold, and a kind of quiet resignation. Lisa stopped for a moment, her breath forming little clouds in the air. She saw the young man in the thin jacket, his shoulders hunched against the wind. She saw the elderly woman, her fingers trembling as she gripped her bag. And she saw the teenager, her cheeks red from the cold, her eyes darting toward the horizon, hoping for the bus to arrive. Lisa's heart ached. She thought of her own family, her husband, Mark, probably starting a fire at home, her daughter, Emily, curled up with a book. The contrast was stark, and it stirred something deep within her. As she stood there, a memory flooded back, a story her grandmother used to tell her about the Great Blizzard of 1978. Back then, Minneapolis had been buried under feet of snow, and neighbors had come together, sharing blankets, hot meals, and even their homes with those in need. Lisa's grandmother had been one of those neighbors, knitting blankets for families who had lost everything in the storm. That memory brought a lump to Lisa's throat. In her bag, she had a spare blanket, a thick, woolen one her mother had knitted before she passed away. It was a deep green, with tiny embroidered flowers along the edges, a piece of her family's history. Lisa had meant to donate it to a shelter, but in that moment, she knew it belonged here, at this bus stop, with these people. Lisa glanced around, her heart beating a little faster. The wind whipped at her scarf, but she barely noticed. She reached into her bag, pulled out the blanket, and draped it carefully over the bench. It looked almost out of place, a splash of green warmth against the cold, gray metal. She hesitated, then pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket, scribbling a note with a shaky hand, "Stay warm. This is for anyone who needs it." She tucked the note under the blanket, securing it against the wind, and stepped back. For a moment, she stood there, watching the snow settle on the blanket, wondering. About 20 minutes later, a young man named Daniel Carter arrived at the same bus stop. Daniel was 27, a dishwasher at a diner a few blocks away. He worked long hours, often late into the night, to support his younger sister, who was in high school. His jacket was a hand-me-down, far too thin for a Minnesota winter, and his hands were numb despite being shoved deep into his pockets. As he sat on the bench, his body shivering uncontrollably, he noticed something unusual, a green blanket, neatly folded, with a piece of paper peeking out. He leaned closer, reading the note, "Stay warm. This is for anyone who needs it." Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. Surely this wasn't meant for him. He looked around, half expecting someone to claim it, but the bus stop was empty now, the other passengers having boarded their buses. The cold was unbearable, and Daniel couldn't resist any longer. He pulled the blanket around his shoulders, the wool soft and warm against his skin. It smelled faintly of lavender, a scent that reminded him of his mother, who had passed away when he was a teenager. For the first time that day, Daniel felt a flicker of warmth, not just in his body, but in his soul. He sat there, wrapped in the blanket, waiting for his bus, and something shifted inside him. He felt seen, cared for, in a way he hadn't in a long time. As the number 4 bus pulled up, he decided he had to do something to thank the anonymous stranger who had left this gift. Daniel pulled out his phone, his fingers still stiff from the cold, and snapped a picture of the blanket and the note. He opened the Facebook app and posted the photo to a local Minneapolis community group, one with thousands of members. His caption read, "Found this at the Lyndale Avenue bus stop tonight. I don't know who left it, but thank you. I've been so cold, and this blanket made my night. Whoever you are, you're amazing." He hit post, just as he boarded his bus, the blanket still wrapped around him. Little did he know, that post would be the spark that lit a fire of kindness across the city. Within hours, Daniel's post had exploded. It racked up hundreds of likes, shares, and comments. People started sharing their own stories, about how they'd struggled to stay warm, about the times they'd felt invisible in the city's harsh winters. One woman wrote, "I saw a man at that same bus stop last week with no gloves. This makes me want to cry." Another commented, "I'm leaving a scarf at my bus stop tomorrow. Thank you for the inspiration." And that's exactly what happened. The next morning, a young mother left a scarf at a bus stop downtown, with a note that mirrored Lisa's, "Stay warm." By the afternoon, a retired couple dropped off a box of gloves at another stop. A local coffee shop began leaving thermoses of hot cocoa and bags of unsold pastries, each with a message, "Take what you need." The movement grew like wildfire. A group of high school students, inspired by the story, spent their weekend knitting hats and scarves, leaving them at bus stops with little notes of encouragement, "You've got this. And you're not alone." By the end of the week, over 50 bus stops across Minneapolis were adorned with gifts, blankets, coats, socks, even hand warmers. Local news stations caught wind of the story, dubbing it the Blanket Project. They interviewed people who had benefited from the gifts, and their stories were as varied as they were moving. One of those stories came from Maria Alvarez, a 62-year-old homeless woman who had been living on the streets of Minneapolis for nearly a year. Maria had lost her job during the pandemic, and with no family to turn to, she'd been sleeping in doorways and on park benches, her only protection a tattered sleeping bag. That day, she sat at a bus stop near downtown, her hands cracked and red from the cold. She noticed a bright red blanket on the bench, with a pair of gloves tucked inside and a note, "Stay warm, friend." Maria's hands trembled as she wrapped the blanket around herself, the gloves fitting perfectly over her frozen fingers. She sat there, tears streaming down her face, not just from the warmth, but from the realization that someone out there cared. Later, she told a reporter, "I thought the world had forgotten me. I felt invisible. But this blanket, these gloves, they made me feel human again. Someone saw me." Back at her home in South Minneapolis, Lisa sat by the fireplace, a cup of tea in her hands, watching the evening news with her family. The anchor was talking about the blanket project, about the bus stops, the stories, the people who had been touched by this wave of kindness. Lisa's eyes widened as she saw footage of blankets and notes, so similar to the one she'd left. She hadn't told anyone about what she'd done, not her husband, not her daughter, not even her closest friends. But as she watched the images flash across the screen, and heard Maria's story, tears welled up in her eyes. The blanket project didn't fade away with the winter. It grew into something lasting, a tradition that Minneapolis embraced with open arms. Community groups started organizing annual drives to collect blankets, coats, and winter gear, distributing them to those in need. A local nonprofit partnered with the city to install heated shelters at bus stops, ensuring no one would have to wait in the cold again. Lisa eventually came forward, sharing her story in a local newspaper interview, but she was quick to deflect the praise. "I just left a blanket," she said. "The real heroes are the thousands who joined in, who saw a need and acted. That's what makes a community." Her words resonated, and the blanket project became a symbol of what Minneapolis could be, a city where strangers cared for one another, where kindness was as much a part of winter as the snow itself. The story of the bus stop blanket is a reminder that even in the coldest, darkest moments, a single act of compassion can light a fire of hope. Lisa's simple gesture, born from a memory, a blanket, and a desire to help, sparked a movement that warmed an entire city. It showed us the power of seeing a stranger's struggle and choosing to act, no matter how small the gesture might seem. As we move through our own winters, whether they're literal or metaphorical, I hope this tale inspires you to look around. Who in your community might need a little warmth, a blanket, a kind word, a moment of your time? Have you ever experienced or witnessed an act of kindness in a public place, something that stayed with you? Share your story in the comments, I'd love to hear it. And if this story warmed your heart, please like, subscribe to Tales from the Heart, and share it with someone who needs a reminder of the goodness in the world. Let's keep the flame of kindness burning bright, together. Until next time, stay warm, and keep spreading love.